tell it for the first time to people who've never heard it before in cultures that more mirror the first century world. And people are just amazed. I mean, I know people have told the prodigal son parable to people in Africa and stuff that have never heard it. They just follow the thing all the way through and they're just shocked out of their doors. I'm serious. Like, what, you're kidding me? God is like, you're telling me God is like that? Sometimes the shock is, we're sort of congratulating ourselves sitting there at the banquet eating a fatted calf. Well, what we really need to identify with is little brothers. So you look for that shock and then you pass it along. And so what you do is you see where people think they identify with the story as compared to where they actually need to identify with the story, and just sort of almost work with their expectations like Jesus did until the point where you flip it. So that law's boy, man, you claim your inheritance, you go off and on, and you're going to come groveling back. Man, do I have the business for you. Nobody's expecting any fatted calves to be at risk. So what do you want to do? Identification with character. Help the audience identify with the character where they fit in the story. Move toward that point of surprise, that point of kingdom reversal. That's an upside down kingdom. And if people don't leave challenged in a significant way to reevaluate, you probably never found that real point of shock, of reversal, of upside down kingdom in that parable. In terms of how you preach them, sometimes you might simply retell the parable and just have a narrative sermon that is a retelling of the story, either in an ancient way or often in a more contemporized way that helps people identify with the characters. But another approach, sometimes parables are clustered together. Luke 15 and Matthew 13 are both examples of this. What I want you to be forced to do is decide whether you want to preach one of the parables in that chapter or to preach the relationship between them. Luke 15 is a 3-act play. And so you can either choose to preach all 3 of the parables, or in Matthew 13, how the parables relate to one another. You can actually do that deductively. Or you might tell 3 separate stories, or you might isolate one of the stories and talk about it in relationship to the overall story. These are all options. When parables are grouped, there is often, as in Luke 15, a certain amount of intensification or crescendoing that goes on. How you see that in Luke 15, for one thing, the value of the lost item escalates. Probably. The amount is a little imprecise. But probably there's an escalation in value, sheep to coin to person. Certainly, there is a mathematical percentage increase that shows the intensification. 1% of the sheep, 10% of the coinage, 50% of the summage. So intensification. Sometimes when parables are grouped together, it's not just an even cluster, there's sort of a progression of intensification that's going on. But look to see if your parable comes in a group of parables and how it relates to the surrounding ones. Mustard seed occurs in the middle of a group of parables, not in isolation. So you have to think about how all that stuff fits together. You can preach individual parables in Matthew 13, but do so with sensitivity to the whole, rather than just pretending that you can extract it from the context and talk about it separately. So you have to understand what's going on in the surrounding material to preach the individual parable. We don't really have time to talk about miracles very much. I'm trying to decide what to do here. I don't really want you having to write your first New Testament sermon with the parables as the only option. I've given you a couple of handouts on preaching from the miracles that, would probably give you enough to work on if you wanted to sort of choose between, parables and some other options. So I think I'm just going to try to kind of land the plane here and stop with parables. I really had to talk about that gospel writers as portrait artists thing to set the stage for everything else you do in gospels, because it's such a big issue.
Yeah.
But how else can I help you here for a few minutes in preaching from the parables before we wind down? Have you done much preaching from the parables? That's you kind of landed more in this more familiar territory for you. Previous preaching class.
Yeah, I'm in parables right now with Harden,
Uh-huh.
and one of the things that I'm finding in that class about like teaching in the parables is that it's really hard to say that you're going to teach on one parable because of how intertwined they are with the parables around them. So like you're saying, like the parable of the mustard seed. It's really hard to say that I'm going to teach on the parable of the mustard seed because you really have to explain the parable of the sower, and you have to explain the parable of and to really get the full context of the parable of the mustard. So it's really like that's one of the things that I find difficult, just being in that class and learning more about the parables and how Jesus went about teaching it and understanding like, okay, like these 5 parables all connect, and it's not ideal to preach on 5 parables at a time, but they're not, like, how are you going to communicate?
But sometimes I will. Sometimes I'll tell 5, it's almost like a 5-point sermon that's illustration heavy. And I'll just do that. I'll talk about the relationship between them. And I'm putting you in a bind if you choose Matthew 13 on purpose. I'm making you wrestle with that. Do I talk about all of them? Do I talk about one of them with sensitivity to all? But I do think you can efficiently summarize. There's a lot of stuff going on. But It depends on how you're preaching the parable. It does. And I will readily admit that's one of the real challenges. Matthew isn't isolating them. He's presenting them together.
Yeah. And it's just difficult to choose when, like, okay, I need to be more sensitive to this one, but I have to include context versus like, okay, it's really not going to make sense unless I explain all of the surrounding things to it, and that's going to take time.
Yeah, and yet if you've got 10 minutes at church camp, you can talk about the pearl of great price. Knowing what you know about it, how it all fits together, you can do it responsibly without explaining all of that to them. The teacher in me wants to explain it to all of them. But what's really crucial in preaching is to do it with contextual sensitivity so that you represent the parable fairly. The goal of preaching isn't to explain context. The goal of preaching is to get it right within context. Zach, does that make sense?
Yeah.
That to me is a really important distinction. The teacher in me wants to always explain context. But the reality is, as with all study, I don't present everything I know about a passage in the sermon. Some of what I know that doesn't make it into the sermon is the way I responsibly present what does make it into the sermon. It's my checks and balances that cause me to get the message right. I can't always communicate everything I know that causes me. I don't always argue for an understanding of a passage. Sometimes I just have to preach from an informed understanding of the passage. And I can't always show people how it got. But I have to take it very seriously in getting there until I get it right. See what I'm saying? So that's, I don't know what Les would say about that.
No, that makes sense.
But I mean, sometimes I would just say you can't always explain.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, especially if you don't have all the time in the world.
Yeah.
I mean,
And yet sometimes I will preach the relationship between them because I want to help people read the Bible more accurately. So I will do both.
yeah, that one, sometimes I feel like my sometimes weakness is like, I really want them to understand the text as much as they can so that they would see it, read it for the first time. Oh, that's what that, I suffer with that sometimes, that I'm like too content heavy, and
It's so easy. I'm telling you, everything about our experience here nudges us in the direction of being content heavy.
yeah,
And you talk to the people that are serving at the local church level. I mean, one of the first things they'll say in terms of the adjustments you gotta make,
yeah,
you gotta back off the content attachment. And of course, those of us who are professors want to resist that, right? No. And there's a delicate balancing act, because sometimes, honestly, I think we settle for less content than we could provide. Sometimes I think we sell our listeners short.
yeah.
And sometimes I think we just need to get better so that we can deliver more content in the way they want to hear it.
Yeah.
But it's also true that a lot of us would benefit from backing off just a touch and just trying to concentrate more on the most crucial content to understand the passage as compared to everything we know that's interesting and insightful about it.
My dad preached for a long time, and I was writing a couple sermons and stuff, and he just said, so your first copy is usually your worst copy. And I thought, okay, well, I mean, he does, because the first time for the first 3 years, I sounded like a comic writer, because I lost too many people in God. It's too much, like 10% of what you say is usually what they take in, and you have to ask, like, what 10% do you want them to?
Yeah. I'm feeling really bad about the fact that we can't talk about this more. Let me put a few resources up here for your attention. Parables class, you may be getting at this stuff. Are others of you in the parables class? Okay.
Very
Okay.
Like, I think 3 of us are in there.
All right, so I'm wasting your old stuff. I don't even know if I talk about parables Klein Snodgrass, Stories with Intent. If I was a local church preacher and I was going to only own one book on the parables for preaching purposes, I would buy Klein Snodgrass, Stories with Intent.
That's excellent
Okay,
for this session.
good. Craig Blomberg's stuff on interpreting the parables and preaching the parables is floating around out there. It's pretty good stuff.
That's what we use.
That's our second textbook.
See, us is the other way around.
Longer for the quizzes and then.
And then we did a book review the other Monday.
All right. Yeah, so you guys are getting a lot of the good stuff then. I'm wasting your time. But man, now I know that everybody's going to do a parable sermon and that they're going to be really good.